Hi everyone, so I'm Hiroki and I'm the CEO and co-founder of GoCardless. As David said, we make it really easy for businesses to accept recurring payments via direct debit. We've been going for about 4 years now, and we're now the biggest provider in the UK. We work with tens of thousands of businesses, helping them to collect subscriptions and other regular payments every month. I'd like to talk to you all today about how I believe financial service companies and fintech companies are innovating by design. And really, I guess the question is, like, what is fintech company? Because I think it's quite a new industry. And when we first started GoCardless, we certainly didn't think of ourselves as a fintech company. It wasn't even a term we'd heard of before. So what is really different about what we're doing compared to all of the other existing providers and banks that came before us? And for me, I think the clearest answer can be seen in the numbers. If you look at it, banks spend over $200 billion every year on technology. And even though they spend all of this money, none of that spending seems to see its way to the consumer experience or to fueling any innovations. So why is that? Well, it turns out that most of this spending goes towards maintenance. And what's worse is that it's estimated that 20% of that spending is just totally wasted. It's not just that, like, they're maintaining their systems, it doesn't even go towards keeping the lights on. And then when you compare that to fintech companies, just $12 billion was invested in fintech companies last year. I'd like for you all to think about that for a moment. All of the innovation that we're seeing right now in this room and elsewhere is being fueled by less than a quarter of what the banks are throwing away each and every year on technology. So how can that be the case? Well, my belief is that one of the fundamental things that differs between fintech companies and the banks is design. For us, design is our fundamental competitive advantage. And so I'd love to talk to you all about how I believe that's the case. But before I do, I think it's important to define what I mean by design. Because for a lot of people, design is about how does something look? How does it feel? But for me, it's much more than that. Design is about how something works. It's about creating beautiful solutions to human problems. And as Peter Thiel says, in order to win in a market, your solution needs to be 10x better than what came before it. And for many companies, that means being 10x cheaper or 10x faster. But in our world, it's being 10x easier that counts. A really great example of this is how we've worked on direct debit. So direct debit, before we started doing this, it wasn't possible for small businesses to use. And no one had ever really questioned this. Why is it that the British Gas and the Vodafones of this world all collect payment this way, but none of the small businesses do? And so when we first looked at this, well, what we realized was that the answer was very, very simple. The banks just wouldn't give them access to the system. And the reason they didn't is because the system is very complicated. And what's more, it gives people a pipe directly into people's bank accounts. And obviously, the banks, and understandably, the banks were worried that smaller businesses wouldn't be sophisticated enough to manage this system, and they might create really big problems. So instead of trying to figure out a way around it or how they could support these businesses, they just closed off the system entirely. So how did we change that? Well, when we first started, we realized that every direct debit transaction has hundreds of settings. And we thought that was crazy. We didn't think that customers should think about these things when they're collecting money. So we abstracted them all away, and we just managed them in the background. And by doing that, we just exposed the settings that people really cared about. Who you're collecting payments from, how much, and how often. And we really foolproofed the system. It made it very, very difficult to make big mistakes. And by doing this, we were able to open up the service in a totally different way. Instead of having to go to your bank, apply through a 3-month process, and then usually getting discarded, you can just sign up to our service immediately and start collecting payments today. And this has fueled some really great growth for us. So within 4 years, we've now just hit the $1 billion mark, and we're processing payments for tens of thousands of businesses every year. Now, for me, I think there's really 3 things that matter when it comes to design. It's not just about a fundamental belief in design that differentiates us, it's these 3 things. So the first is about starting from a clean slate. A lot of the press goes towards how starting from a clean technical slate makes it much easier for modern companies to compete with the older ones. And that's definitely true. We don't have to maintain any kind of legacy code. We get to build on top of open source projects that help us to spread the cost of maintaining our services. And we get to also take advantage of anything like the technologies that the big companies like Google and Facebook are building. But that's not the only thing. It's also that we get to design from a clean slate as well. Much of what defines what we're able to do is the constraints under which we operate. Now, if you're a bank, you have to work with everyone. And many of your customers, they may not have the internet or smartphones or email. So you still have to send those letter notifications. You still have to have those physical branches. And you still have to process those checks. But when you start from a clean slate, you can just be much more focused. We get to just define who our customers are, and more importantly, who we're not going to cater for. And by doing this, we're able to create really great experiences for a small set of users, rather than just give an okay experience to a really wide set of people. A really, really great example of this for me is Mpesa. Mpesa is a money transfer service in Africa. It was actually started by the telecoms operators there in Kenya. And they were trying to solve the problem of how do you transfer money for a largely unbanked population. Now, because they were the telecoms companies, they didn't have any kind of legacy code or legacy systems that they had to maintain for this. They were creating something from a clean slate. And by targeting just this very specific use case, they were able to create a system that was much, much better than what existed before. And they've quickly grown to become the de facto way of transferring money in many of these countries. And the reason I think this is such a great example is because it shows how powerful this effect can be. The telecoms operators were able to beat the banks at their own game, even though they're just as big and just as bureaucratic. The second key is being able to work in short, iterative cycles. For me, a product is not great until you've worked on it over many, many iterations. Just look at the iPhone. Imagine if Apple had never continued to build new versions after their first one. Design is about making thousands of small decisions. It's not about one big decision up front. And unfortunately, none of us are fortune tellers. It's really hard to even make one good decision at a time, let alone anticipate thousands up front. And so, for me, there's 3 things that we can do to fix this. The first is that we work in small increments. By breaking problems down, we make them more manageable. The second is about reducing the cost of each of those steps, and more importantly, reducing the cost of the mistakes that you make, because you'll make plenty. And the third is about learning as quickly as possible at each stage. Each of these things depend on working in an iterative cycle very, very fast. And for us, that's something that's enabled by a lot of the things that we do today that are different from what came before us. We're able to work in agile teams where we deploy code on daily, if not hourly basis. We can automate our testing rather than having these manual QA departments. And instead of releasing in annual cycles, we release all of the time. That's something that's only been possible in the last 10 years because of the internet. And then the final step is about focus. The banks serve every product to every customer, whether it's payment processing, consumer credit, or a savings account. I can go to my bank for all of these things. But if they're busy trying to build everything, then how can they perfect anything? And this contrasts greatly with all the fintech companies that you're seeing today. We're all laser focused on very specific products, whether it's TransferWise with FX, Crowdcube with funding, or Funding Circle with loans. Each and every one of us is pushing hard in a very specific direction, and that is how we're able to make better services than what existed before. Now, for us, this is actually something that we're forced to do. The thing is, we have very limited resources. So it's actually unfathomable for us to think about creating other products outside of our core offerings. And this forces us to be very, very focused on building very specific niche expertise. I'm pretty sure that my colleagues are the world experts on direct debit, even though we've only been going for a few years. And out of this, we get to build very, very surprising and small innovations. So whether it's how quickly we're able to process a payment, how smooth we're able to make the onboarding process, it's very small incremental improvements that make the difference. So I guess a question that comes out of all of this is, can these fintech companies maintain their edge as they grow? Are we only able to innovate because we're small enough to work iteratively, to be really focused, and to have a clean slate? My belief is that the internet has changed the equation. We're able to expand the market that we're working in to a different order of magnitude than what was there before. A great example is looking at the banks. ICBC is the biggest bank in the world. They serve over 500 million customers, and it's taken them about 500,000 employees and 30 years to amass that. And then compare that to Facebook. They are about to hit 1.5 billion users, who they've built for with just 10,000 employees in less than 10 years. It's this change in the order of magnitude and the speed of customer acquisition that means that fintech companies are able to go global way before they think about diversifying their product offerings. And so by doing that, we're able to create much, much better services. We're able to maintain a focus and a small, lean team. And I believe that we'll be able to continue our dominance. For example, when we talk to our customers, they love the way that we're trying to build this network on top of all of these disparate direct debit systems around the world. They're all kind of similar, but different enough that you don't want to deal with them separately. And this is the kind of innovation that you're only able to create when you're very focused on a very, very specific offering. So how will the banks continue in this world? I think this is a really interesting question. You know, will the banks be able to change their businesses and their organizations so that they can compete with us effectively? Or will they find specific areas where they'll maintain their dominance? Or perhaps they'll just be completely disaggregated by a plethora of startups? I don't think any of us know the answer to this question yet. But what I am sure of is that one thing we will see is that users get a much better experience as a result of all of this innovation. And that can only be a great thing. Thank you very much.
Hiroki, there's a new job in banking as of today. There's a bank called Barclays that seems to be in between bosses. And I just want to parachute you into that job, okay? And I want you to take not just what you've learned at GoCardless, but what you learn from talking to your friends in finance tech startups. Day one, you send a memo to all of Barclays saying these are the things we have to do. Yeah. With that startup, finance tech startup mindset, what sort of things would be in that memo? Yeah, I mean, for me, it feels pretty obvious that the ecosystem is changing and a lot of banks are ignoring that. And I think that if I was in the position of the CEO of Barclays, then I'd try and embrace that change. So what is it that we're able to do to change the way that we work with all of these people in the ecosystem and create the infrastructure and the support mechanisms that enable these businesses? And by doing that, I think that there's an opportunity to really become the backbone of a lot of the fintech startups that are kind of springing up today. So I think it's about rethinking the position in the market, not necessarily being
the person that's the gatekeeper to all of the consumer relationships, and not necessarily covering the whole gamut of services. It's about providing this infrastructure layer and enabling. Exactly. That's what I do. So, and I think that there's big challenges to that. They need to completely change the way they operate. They need to, and this isn't just Barclays, it's like all banks, right? They need to change the way they operate. They need to speed up their decision-making time, and they need to be able to work at the same pace of all the fintech companies that are around them.
Any Barclays board members who are here, Hiroki will be available in the networking breaks. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.